Hi, good morning. My name is Asiya Hirji, and I am the supervising lawyer with the Refugee and Immigration Division of Downtown Legal Services, which is the University of Toronto's community clinic. On behalf of the panelists, I would like to welcome you to today's conference entitled Access Denied: Ongoing Barriers to Refugee Sponsorship in Canada. Thank you so much for sharing your morning with us, and a huge thank you to our talented panelists who have come to share their expertise with us today. This webinar is being hosted in the city of Toronto, and so we would first like to acknowledge that we are meeting on land that is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. It is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As you're all well aware, the imposition of the requirement on overseas refugees to obtain UNHCR or refugee status documents from host countries has stood as a barrier to impactful refugee resettlement in Canada since it was first introduced. We join in the chorus of voices calling for suspension of these requirements, certainly for Afghanistan, but also for all refugee applicants. Today, we will hear from 5 speakers who will take us through the genesis of the history of the UNHCR and status requirements, its codification into domestic Canadian law, making it a gatekeeper to overseas refugee resettlement, and its impacts on both the macro and micro level to refugee protection. Our speakers will also share with us some of their own lived experiences with the refugee resettlement program and discuss the stories of others who have been impacted by the requirements. We hope that each of you takes something away from today's talk and that you will lend your voices to advocacy efforts to eliminate this unnecessary requirement. Our first speaker today is Pierre-André Thériault. Pierre-André is a postdoctorate fellow at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law and the co-editor of the journal Refuge. His research focuses on immigration and refugee law, and he has written and published extensively on the topic. He has acted as a legal expert with the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program Advisory Committee. Pierre-André previously worked as an immigration lawyer, and prior to that was a judicial clerk to the Honorable Mr. Justice de Montigny. He is also the recipient of numerous awards, including the Nathanson Center of Transnational Human Rights, Crime and Security Fellowship. Today, Pierre-André will speak to us about the inception of UNHCR and status requirement programs, their origins, tensions arising from the programs, and the 2012 reforms. Pierre-André, over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. Thank you, Asiya, for the introduction, and to DLS for hosting this webinar. I'm really pleased to be here today to talk about the program. So, in my presentation, I want to provide sort of a general overview of the PSR program, some of the concerns that have been expressed over time by both the government and the sponsorship community, to better understand how the 2012 reforms to the PSR, why the 2012 reform took place, reforms that included this requirement that refugees sponsored by groups of 5 and community sponsor groups, but not SAWs, have a refugee status determination by the UNHCR or a foreign state in order to be eligible. So I'm sure many of you here today know the PSR program was created when the 1976 Immigration Act came into force in 1978. And the coming into force of the act coincided with a vast exodus of refugees from Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. And the program was hugely successful in bringing to Canada over 60,000 so-called Indo-Chinese refugees in 1979 and 1980. An important aspect to note about the development of the program is that in the very early years of the program, the vast majority of sponsorships were what we call nameless sponsorships or visa offer referred sponsorships. Refugees were selected mainly by the government, meaning that the government had this primary control over who was being resettled. Throughout the later part of the 1980s, that began to change with an increase in family-linked sponsorships. Often refugees were being sponsored by family members who were or who had themselves been previously sponsored. There was a review conducted in the early 1990s by Employment and Immigration Canada that indicated that the government was concerned with the PSR program shifting towards some kind of a family reunification program. But more recent government policy statements present a bit of a different view, with the government now recognizing that family-linked sponsorships are in fact aligned with UNHCR priorities and the immigration legislation stated objective of family reunification. Nevertheless, this issue of control over selection does remain a point of tension within the program, and especially when we think about the BVOR program, and I'll get to that a little bit later. Another issue that became of concern to the government and the sponsorship community in the early 1990s is the problem of ballooning processing times. In 1992, the government review that I just mentioned reported that PSR cases were taking between 18 to 24 months to process. And the government at the time set a target of 6 to 9 months for processing. I'm just going to share my screen here. So I hope this has worked. The processing times, however, continued to be difficult to control, especially after 2001, as you can see from this graph that I'm showing you right now, that was published as part of a study conducted in 2007. So this 2007 review reported that processing times had doubled in the previous 4 years, from 17 months to 35 months in 2005. And I'll get in later in my presentation, I'll get to where processing times have been in later years, but I just do want to note that these processing times don't include the portion of processing sponsorship eligibility that occurs in Canada, and that can add another 6 to 12 months to the process. And please, if my screen sharing is not working, someone please just jump in with the audio and let me know. Low approval rates have also been cited as a concern by both the government and the sponsorship community. So the same 2007 report that I just referred indicated that low approval rates were affecting program efficiency and were responsible for the growing backlog of cases. This graph, part of that study, shows that between 98 and 2005 approval, or 2006 rather, approval rates were averaged 49% for PSRs and 31% for GARs. It's important to note that approval rates had started to go up even before the implementation of the UNHCR requirement for groups of 5 and community sponsors in 2011. So before the implementation of the program, approval rates were at about 70%. And I'll get to that later when I discuss the impacts of the reform. Interestingly, this 2007 report attributed the high refusal rates to failures in screening by sponsors. And that was a sort of a view that was challenged by the sponsorship community, noting that the report had in fact failed to assess how many refusals are in fact linked to issues outside the control of sponsors. And mainly changes in country conditions. So in other words, sponsors were saying that the long processing delays contribute to inflated refusals based on changes in country conditions. So against this sort of backdrop of concerns over selection control, ballooning processing times, and low approval rates, the Harper government adopted a series of reforms to the PSR program in 2011 and 2012. So the first element of the reform was the elimination of the source country class. That was a class that had existed since 1997 and that allowed for the resettlement of internally displaced persons from certain designated countries of origin. And the stated rationale for the repeal was that processing those cases posed significant challenges due to the fact that IDPs did not come under the protection of the UNHCR. And the government could not rely on the UNHCR pre-screening and referral, leading to a number of ineligible applications being submitted and contributed to, which contributed to the low GAR grant rate that I just mentioned. Second, the second piece was the introduction of the BVOR category. As I'm sure a lot of you know here, the BVOR program is a hybrid cost sharing program where sponsors sponsor a refugee that is selected by the government. So the selection process and control over selection is shifted to the government under this new category. The third measure implemented was limiting the number of applications sponsorship agreement holders are able to submit each year. We call them yearly caps. And initially, there were also further limitations for refugees in specific visa offices or in specific third countries called subcaps. But those subcaps were abolished by the current government in 2017. And the final piece of the reform was requiring that the other two types of sponsors, groups of 5 and community sponsors, can only sponsor refugees who have previously obtained a refugee status determination by the UNHCR or a foreign state. These last two changes, so the caps and the UNHCR RSD requirement, were designed to limit the number of applications that enter the system so as to reduce overall timelines. The UNHCR requirement was also presented as a way to increase approval rates. I would say that the UNHCR requirement has been the most controversial aspect of the reform because of how it effectively disqualifies certain refugee population from accessing refugee sponsorship through Group of Five and community sponsor groups. And that is mostly what the remainder of this talk will be about. But before handing over the camera to the next speakers, I do want to mention a few things about how cases are being processed and discuss the measurable impact of the UNHCR requirement. And I also want to share a few recent developments that I'm sure some of you may not be aware of. Excuse me. So it's important to understand that even though refugees sponsored by Groups of Five or community sponsor group must now have a previous refugee status determination, Canadian visa officers always make, in addition, their own independent determination with regard to refugee status. And they do not, at least not consistently, consider the existence of UNHCR status as evidence, certainly not as proof, but even not necessarily even evidence that the applicant qualifies as a refugee under the convention. And in fact, it was only, well, relatively recently that the Federal Court of Canada ruled that visa officers could not, in their assessment, simply ignore a UNHCR designation altogether. So the impact of the requirement on processing efficiency is a bit unclear. Just going to share my screen again here. Okay, I'm showing another slide here. The impact of the UNHCR requirement on approval rates in the PSR stream is also unclear. I've compiled data here on approval rates from 2011 to 2018. I don't have more recent data, unfortunately. I'm sharing that with you right now, but this is interesting because it shows that in 2011, so before the requirement kicked in, the approval rates were in the high 60s, and they remain relatively stable until 2015, at which point they did go up significantly. But you have to remember that was at the time of the Syrian refugee movement and a different way of assessing cases. They had a very high approval rate, and they were approved on prima facie basis, and a lot of them were processed. So that, in my opinion, really contributed to the high approval rates that we see in 2015, 16, and 17. Now, interestingly, in the first calendar year after the end of the Syrian measures, approval rates went back down to really close to what they were in 2011. So when you see in 2018, they were just at 70, just marginally higher than the 2012, 2014 rates. With regard to processing times, I think the impact of the UNH requirement is a bit unclear in many respects. The processing times continue to increase even after the introduction of the UNHCR requirement in 2012, reaching a high of 54 months in 2015. Granted, during this period, the government was still processing a backlog of cases that were submitted before the reform. Processing times did start to decrease starting in 2016, but here again, it appears to have mostly been due to significant increases in yearly admission targets. Some of you may remember that in 2017, the government did commit to bringing processing times down to 12 months by 2019, and processing times around that time did continue to decrease for a while, but as a result of the COVID pandemic, processing times and backlogs have started to balloon again. And just earlier this week, I checked processing times for a few high volume visa offices, and they're now excessively high, reaching 45 months in Lebanon, plus 7 months of in Canada processing. It's also worth noting that even though the number of group of 5 applications and community sponsor group applications is certainly reduced compared to what it would be without the UNHCR requirement, I think it's important to see that a lot of that caseload ends up being shifted to SAWs, who are exempt from the UNHCR requirement, but they have yearly caps. So those organizations end up either developing a backlog of their own at the front end of the process, or just turning people away. Finally, before handing the camera over to the next speakers, I want to touch on some new and encouraging developments. On April 6th, so just about 6 weeks ago, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration issued a press release calling on the government to waive the UNHCR requirement for Ukrainian and Afghan refugees. And this was a motion that was supported by the Liberal members of the committee. And even more recently, this was on April 25, just about a month ago, the Minister of Immigration appeared before a House of Commons Special Committee on Afghanistan and was asked if the government would follow the recommendation. And the minister stated, and I quote, "We're waiving the requirement for refugee status determination for some private sponsorship applications, which broadens sponsor access to the program." What that means is a bit unclear. No announcement in this regard has been made, and I confirmed with a number of people just yesterday. The UNHCR requirement still for groups of 5 and community sponsor groups still applies across the board to all populations, including Afghan refugees and Ukrainian refugees. But through my conversations with people in government and others in the sector, I was able to confirm that the government is seriously considering a temporary waiving of the requirement with regard to the Afghan population and maybe the Ukrainian population as well. And I just want to note before I end that if you want to know more about these developments, the Canadian Council for Refugees has a group of 5 sponsor committee that has periodic meetings, and they do have a meeting next week on June 1st. So I encourage you to get involved if you want more details about these developments. So so that's it for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'll hand it over to you, Asiya.
Thank you so much, Pierre-André. I don't know about others, but I found that table particularly shocking. That clearly demonstrates that there's no real measurable impact to refugee resettlement through the introduction of the status requirement. So thank you so much for that. Our next speakers are Anisha Sivathas and Alice Zhao, who are students at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law. They were caseworkers in the Refugee and Immigration Law Division at Downtown Legal Services for the 2021-2022 academic year. They have co-authored a paper entitled Access Denied, Calling for Revocation of Canada's Refugee Status Document Requirement in the Private Sponsorship Refugee Program, which is sort of the catalyst for today's talk. We are hoping to disseminate that paper in a few days, and we're hoping that you will all read and share it with the various groups and organizations and individuals that you're involved with. Alice and Anisha will be discussing the background of the UNHCR and status requirements, the impact on refugees from the imposition of this gatekeeper requirement, criticisms of how overseas refugees are treated in the program, and also we'll discuss a call for revocation of this requirement. So Alice and Anisha, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us today, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Asiya. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's event. I just want to confirm that everyone can hear me and see my screen before we get started.
Yes, we can see everything.
Okay, great, thank you. So just like Asiya mentioned, my colleague Alice and I will be talking to you a little bit about the history of the requirement, which includes the background on why this requirement was implemented, as well as the IRCC's rationale for why they wanted to implement this requirement. We will then move on to discussing why this requirement is problematic, focusing specifically on its impact on the Afghan refugee crisis. Next, we will then highlight the criticism that this requirement has faced and continues to face from stakeholders and refugee advocates in the community. And then finally, we will advocate for the revocation of the requirement, or for the minister to issue a public policy exemption for Afghan refugees, as done previously for Syrian and Iraqi refugees, and currently for Ukrainian refugees, which looks like it may be on the horizon based on Pierre-André's presentation.
Right, Anisha, we're just getting some comments that there's quite a bit of background noise where you are. I don't know. I don't know if you're on your AirPods or if
I am. Is this better? Should I just speak louder?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Sorry, let me see if I can. Okay. How's this? Is this better?
Way better.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I apologize for that. Okay. So just going into some background, as you have previously heard already, in 2012, there were a variety of different changes that were made to the Private Sponsorship of Refugees program, also known as the PSRP. As part of these changes, there was a requirement that was imposed that in order for overseas refugee seekers to be eligible to be sponsored either through the Group of Five or community sponsor streams, they needed to have a refugee status document, either from UNHCR or a foreign state. So this is the relevant legislative scheme, which was amended in order to implement these changes. So specifically, it was section 153 sub 1 of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Regulations. And here on the slide, we've just highlighted exactly the language that was incorporated in order to implement this requirement. So you can see exactly what this now requires. So in order to understand the rationale for implementing this requirement, Alice and I did quite a bit of research into trying to figure out, what type of literature was out there, what the government had released in order to kind of explain their thought process behind kind of the planning and then the implementation of the requirement. So we found the regulatory impact analysis, which was conducted by the government to help them understand the potential effect of bringing these changes in. And overall, what we found was that the government felt that the lack of having this type of requirement reduced the efficiency of the PSRP program, and it detracted from its original objectives, which were to expand Canada's refugee protection capacity and engage civil society in resettlement. They also felt that this requirement would help them target administrative and operational inefficiencies in the overseas refugee determination process, mainly due to increased demand for the program based on family reunification, as well as ineffective control of application intake. So we also found that the government's stated intention of bringing in this requirement was to resettle refugees who are most in need of Canada's protection while increasing approval rates and being able to better manage the PSR inventory. So the intended outcome was that by implementing this requirement, it would help them improve operational efficiency as well as reduce application backlog. So overall, they believe that this would reduce the number of applications that were least likely to be approved and be successful, and thus increase approval rates and then reduce wait times. Hopefully, all of this combined together would help reduce this overall backlog. So the impact analysis also included some explanation as to the rationale for why IRCC wanted to rely on UNHCR. This slide is a direct quote from the analysis, which really just explains that they wanted to kind of rely on UNHCR's experience with conducting refugee status determinations, as well as just their the fact that they are just this authoritative body in this field. So now we'll pass things over to Alice to discuss the specific impact of this requirement in the Afghan refugee crisis.
Thank you so much, Anisha. So I'm going to now provide some context into the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and explain why revoking the Canada's UNHCR status requirement is such an important topic for us. So to start off with, as we know from watching the news and just being human in this world, the Afghan crisis has actually been going on for more than 40 years. There's a history of continued conflict, chronic poverty, and food insecurity, and also since last August, the imposition of Taliban rule in Afghanistan. So as a result of all of these factors, there's now an estimated 6 million refugees who have been forced to flee Afghanistan just this year alone, with an estimated 5.7 million Afghan refugees settled in 5 neighboring countries, all of whom are in desperate need of humanitarian aid, including shelter, food, water, non-food items, health services, livelihood assistance, and also cash assistance. So as we can see, Afghan refugees are now the 3rd largest displaced group in the world and in desperate need of help, especially after the imposition of the Taliban rule in last August. As we know, the Taliban are now in charge of Afghanistan, and under their rule, conditions have become much more oppressive. For citizens, there is now an increase in the amount of restrictions of their mobility, and reports of arbitrary detention, summary executions, disappearances of anti-regime advocates, the raiding of homes of journalists, activists, human rights leaders, and an overall deterioration of women's rights, including firing women from the civil service, restricting education for girls. And all of these factors combined together indicate for us that the Afghan humanitarian crisis is worsening and also continuing, which makes the UNHCR requirement status revocation very important for us today. So the starting point of how we can assist refugees goes back to the Refugee Convention, which is an international instrument that Canada has signed. And it essentially gives Canada's international obligation to refugees as non-refoulement, which is this idea that we do not want to return refugees either voluntarily or forcefully to the country of their origin, basically the places where they are fleeing. And unfortunately, with this UNHCR requirement that Canada has imposed, we are now increasing this risk of refoulement of refugees to Afghanistan, despite the UNHCR body issuing a non-return advisory for refugees from Afghanistan starting last August, which coincides, of course, with the Taliban takeover and the worsening of country conditions in Afghanistan. So to describe a little bit more about why the UNHCR status is increasing the likelihood of refoulement of refugees, it's really an administrative problem, as Pierre-André and Anisha have just described, because refugees and sponsors experience significant administrative delays in trying to obtain this UNHCR status. Without the status, refugees can't come to Canada, and sponsors in Canada are just, waiting and waiting and waiting to help refugees, but they can't help them because they're missing this particular document. And while refugees and sponsors are waiting for this document, refugees have to live with either a temporary status or sometimes even an illegal status in their host country. As Mellissa and Tamana will be explaining later, these are very, very tough situations for refugees to be in. And it's incumbent on all of us to see what we can do to help them. From a broad perspective, I'm going to talk about the challenges that refugees face with their temporary or illegal statuses in host countries. So the first problem that we've talked about is the refoulement problem, which is if you don't have an official status, obviously your ability to stay in a foreign country is limited. You can be deported or repatriated at any time. And even if you have a temporary status, in our research, Anisha and I found that refugees often have limited mobility rights and their movement is severely restricted in countries that are hosting them. So Iran, for example, have designated certain portions of the country as no-go zones for refugees, where refugees are just not welcome. And countries such as Pakistan have taken active steps to close borders to keep refugees out or designate villages for refugees to stay in. So as you can imagine, this limited mobility is very difficult for refugees, especially when refugees are trying to access local government services, right? Including healthcare, education, police aid, social assistance, and old age benefits. It's also very, very difficult, we found in our research, for refugees to access protection from local host governments. So they are at an increased risk of being subject to government corruption, which includes the destruction and confiscation of their personal property, instances of arbitrary detention, and going back to the refoulement problem again, refugees are also subject to deportation, forcible removal, or worse than that, torture, and sometimes even death. I'm going to move on now to the next slide. Even without all of these problems, refugees also face challenges in their everyday life due to their lack of official status. So in many countries, refugees are unable to find affordable shelter, or they're unable to purchase property because they lack a status. And without a status, sometimes refugees have trouble accessing meaningful work and employment. And sometimes, even worse, they have difficulty opening bank accounts or accessing cash. And in countries such as Pakistan, refugees also have difficulties accessing cell phone service, driver's licenses, and car transportation. So a lot of these necessities for everyday life, your shelter, your employment, your funds, are much more challenging for refugees because of their in limbo administrative status. And this is in addition to the marginalization, xenophobia, and exploitation that refugees sometimes face from local residents in coast countries who are not welcoming of refugees. So I'm going to turn it back to Anisha, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about a case study that we read about of Miss Adele, who was luckily traveling in Turkey when the Taliban took over Afghanistan last August. So Miss Adele was a member of the Afghan government. She worked for women's rights and she advocated for equal gender parity between men and women. So very luckily for her, she happened to be traveling in Turkey at the time. And as soon as the Taliban took over, she thought, oh no, I can't possibly return to Afghanistan where I am, one, a woman, two, a member of the former government, and three, an advocate for human rights, and four, a member of a religious and ethnic minority, and where she thought she would be subject to torture or death upon returning to Afghanistan. She decided to stay in Turkey, where she had a temporary 9-month visitor visa. And while she was in Turkey, she tried to apply for the UNHCR status requirement, and she faced many administrative hurdles and was ultimately told that getting this status approved for her would take at least a year, which of course, where she had only the 9-month visa, left her with at least 3 months of not having a legal status in Turkey. And she also tried to apply for official refugee status recognition from the Turkish government, which also subjected her to a very long administrative runabout. And while she was waiting at the time, she could not find work. So she ended up, at the time of her interview, living in a rented 1-bedroom apartment that was very small and very cramped. She had to share that with her family that she paid to smuggle out of Afghanistan. And it was just an incredibly difficult time for her because she also could not find work. So this story, we'll hear more from Tamana and Mellissa later, is not unique. And this is one of the bases for criticisms of the UNHCR requirements, which I will now turn back to Anisha to discuss.
Thanks so much, Alice. So when Alice and I were doing our research, one thing that we noticed was that, first of all, before the requirement was implemented, IRCC actually sent out a call for comment regarding the proposed changes. And in response to this, many stakeholders and advocates provided substantive feedback. And much of this feedback was actually comprised of criticisms of the requirement. So for example, the Canadian Council for Refugees voiced their concerns that this requirement would have exclusionary effects on those who would not be able to obtain this official documentation, especially based on the vulnerability of refugees who are often the ones who are in the most precarious situations, like Alice mentioned. The National Immigration Law section of the Canadian Bar Association also opposed the requirement for many reasons, one of which were the fact that they believe this requirement would encourage international people smuggling, mainly due to people wanting to circumvent this requirement based on the delays and corruption that can exist in the recognition process that's associated either with the state or UNHCR in many different countries. Unfortunately, in response to these numerous concerns that were raised prior to the requirement being implemented, IRCC merely just reiterated its intention with this requirement, which was that it would help them improve and address administrative inefficiencies. And they also redirected people to the SAH stream, the sponsorship agreement holder stream, which does not require the official status. In fact, this seemed to be their standard response to this type of criticism. So the concerns that were being raised really weren't being taken into consideration in a meaningful way based on this response. Even after the requirement was implemented, it continued to face criticism and still faces criticism to this day, especially in the context of the Afghan refugee crisis. So we looked into various different resources that discuss the requirement, and we listed a couple of them here on the slide here. In 2016, Dr. Shauna Labman wrote an article where she discussed the requirement in the context of the Syrian refugee crisis, where she mentions that it prevents sponsorship during mass refugee flows where UNHCR cannot conduct individual status determinations. There was also an article written more recently by the Migration Policy Institute, where they also talk about this requirement and its impact on sponsors and organizations that are involved with overseas refugee settlement. And they also mention this idea of a patchwork approach, mainly based on the fact that the availability of documentation varies between countries because the process is so different between countries. So what may be very accessible to refugees in one country may not necessarily be the same experience for refugees in other countries. Before I discuss this slide, I also want to mention that in 2017, the Refugee Research Network and the Center for Refugee Studies submitted a policy brief to the federal government where they also recommended that Canadian officials apply a prima facie refugee recognition to other refugee nationalities and to eliminate the status requirement overall. The Canadian Council for Refugees, once again, also called on the government to remove the requirement in 2013 due to it being a significant obstacle for timely private sponsorship, which is essentially what they also raised in their response to the call for comment before this requirement was implemented. On this slide, this lists the organizations that have more recently called for the revocation of the requirement, specifically in the context of the Afghan refugee crisis. In November 2021, the World Refugee and Migration Council actually issued an open letter to the federal government regarding an urgent call to action in response to the Afghan crisis. And within this, they request the removal of the UNHCR requirement, as well as a recognition of this crisis as a prima facie refugee situation. And as you can see here on the slide, the council is comprised of all of these different organizations. So this includes several different organizations in the refugee advocate community who are all united in calling for the revocation of this requirement. And then in December 2021, the Canadian Bar Association made submissions to the minister, where they also call for changes to Canada's response to the Afghan crisis. And within this, they include many different recommendations, one of which were to remove the status requirement based on the significant obstacles that Afghan refugees have been facing in obtaining status in neighboring countries like Iran and Pakistan. So one thing we also wanted to just point out was that the government has previously revoked this requirement for Syrian and Iraqi refugees, and more recently in the context of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, which goes to show that they have done this before, they can do this again. It also shows that the nature of this requirement is quite arbitrary, meaning that it likely is not necessary. So there really is no good reason to keep this requirement for Afghan refugees, especially given the worsening humanitarian crisis, as Alice mentioned earlier. So I will turn it back over to Alice now.
Thank you so much, Anisha. So to conclude our presentation, we really want to drive the point home. We want to advocate for the Canadian government and all of you to please take steps. This is an immediate call for action to revoke the UNHCR requirement for Afghan refugees in light of everything that we have presented. There's no good reason for this particular requirement to exist. It appears to be discretionary and can be waived for different types of refugees. And we think in this case, in light of the ongoing humanitarian crisis, that we have a moral duty to help Afghan refugees and also follow our international obligations that Canada has now signed on to as a signatory of the Refugee Convention. And where this UNHCR requirement really does increase the risk of refugee refoulement and also increases the length of time that refugees must live in host countries where their existence is very second class. We really call on the Canadian government and all of us to do our part to take immediate steps to revoke this particular requirement or to institute a policy exception so we can better address the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and also help these refugees that are very, very much in need. So thank you so much for listening to Anisha and I. We will turn it now back to Asiya and our other speakers to talk about the lived experiences of these refugees and to see what we can do to help everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Alice and Anisha. Just a few points before we move on. I just wanted to note that we do have a question and answer tab at the bottom, the Q&A. We will have some time at the end. There's 2 more speakers at the end of the conference who will have an opportunity to have the panelists answer some questions. So please feel free to put your questions in there. I do see the questions that are in the chat, so I'll try to get through them, but it's just a bit easier to wade through them in the Q&A. So if you're able to, please put them there. And also we are very grateful that both Ian and Shauna, who are authors who were just referenced by Alice and Anisha, are in attendance today. So they've both graciously linked their papers. Please do take a look at them. And a huge thank you to both of them for their work in this area. So our next speaker is Tamana Hafid, who came to Canada as an Afghan refugee when she was 9 years old with her family. Today, she's a lawyer who practices in health law. Since the Taliban takeover in August 2021, she has devoted countless tireless hours to advocating for Afghan refugees. She's a member of the Canadian Afghan Lawyers Association and a supporter of LifeLine Afghanistan. Today, Tamana will be sharing the lived experiences of 3 Afghans and their families in the face of the brutal Taliban takeover. These individuals have been forced to flee Afghanistan and have become refugees. She will discuss their attempts to relocate to Canada and how the UNHCR refugee determination has become a significant barrier to these individuals. Thank you, Tamana.
Thank you, Asiya. First of all, everyone, thank you for attending today. And I hope that with my portion of the seminar today, it really puts a face to the lived experiences of Afghan refugees. The 3 stories that I'm about to tell you are real stories that are currently happening, to just kind of give you the reality of what it means to have this barrier. For us, it can be quite academic, but for a lot of people, it is really affecting their lives. I'm going to share my screen. That said, I don't actually have permission from the individuals to use their names or photographs. So the photographs are not actually the individuals that I'm speaking about. And their names have also been changed given their request to do so. So the first story is about Sarah. Sarah is a young woman who came to Canada from Afghanistan in 2017, and her family stayed in Afghanistan and they were quite happy and successful. She has 2 brothers, one who had finished his MBA and was working, another brother who was in his 2nd year of university, and a young sister who had just finished school. When the Taliban took over, given their fact that they were an ethnic minority group in Afghanistan, given that they were educated and held certain values about how Afghanistan should proceed, they started receiving direct threats to their lives. So they decided that they would leave, a family of 9. This includes elderly parents, 2 brothers, sister-in-laws, a sister, as well as 2 children. In August 2021, after they received the direct threats, they went and moved to Pakistan. In Pakistan, they don't have legal status. They don't have any sort of status. So that means that nobody can work and the children have not been to school since August. They're afraid of working illegally because there are stories about how there were Afghan men who were working in a restaurant, and then the Pakistani government, when they found them working without a permit, forcefully deported them back to Afghanistan, which Alice referred to as refoulement. So right now, there's a family of 9, and they are unable to get the UNHCR RSD. When Sarah contacted the UNHCR in Pakistan, they actually advised her that they had stopped giving the RSD since 2016, and instead they're giving them a certificate. And as we know, the certificate is not actually used in our process. You need the RSD. Pakistan, in terms of its foreign entity itself as a government, these people will not have access to that. There's significant barriers depending, on who you are, what your connections are, what your socioeconomic status is. So since then, Sarah has been supporting a family of 9 in Pakistan by herself. She has no family here. She's working. She's trying her best. So she tried to connect with SAWS, and they have been so far unsuccessful. Limited numbers have been given to SAWS for specific to Afghan refugees. She also tried to do a student visa application for her sister, who actually was accepted to George Brown College for a 2-year program. Unfortunately, it was denied because they could not show that her sister would return back to Afghanistan, which is something that has not been considered in the context of the Ukrainian crisis, where a lot of temporary measures are available to Ukrainian refugees. So that is our first story, a family of 9 in limbo, no job, the children can't go to school, and the UNHCR entity has basically told Sarah that they're just not giving this document to her. Sarah doesn't know what to do. She's stuck, and she was willing to volunteer her story for this event so that it could hopefully be used to waive the requirement and give her family a chance to leave Pakistan and come to Canada for a better life and reunite with her, because family reunification, once again, is not something that has been significantly increased in the context of Afghan refugees versus in the context of Ukrainian refugees. Our second story is Kareem. Kareem is not in Canada. He's in his late 20s. He has 2 children under 5, and his 2 children and his wife are currently living in a guest house in Pakistan. In Afghanistan, he was a journalist, a civil servant, and a writer. He was very left-leaning, and his presentation and work and research was exhibited widely across the media, as well as specifically social media. In the summer of 2020, actually, before the Taliban takeover, one thing I do want to highlight is that things were already changing in Afghanistan. People kind of saw the writing on the wall. They just didn't know that it was going to happen as fast as it did. But that summer, he was followed home after an exhibit, and this is a trigger warning because it's about to get quite heavy. He was attacked by several men who, outside of his house with hammers, they beat him in the head with the hammer. He lost consciousness and then was left to bleed outside his own house. He successfully lived on. However, he has PTSD, he had bleeding in his brain. He also had short-term memory loss. He reported the attack to the local police, but at that time, nothing happened. In August 2021, when the Taliban takeover happened, given the previous incident, he knew what was going to happen to him if he stayed. So he fled his home, and as many people did, not just Kareem, he stayed with friends and his family on rotation so that the Taliban could not track him down, because he knew that if they did, he would just disappear, like countless left-leaning advocates who did so after the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. Fortunately for Kareem, he had outside contacts. He reached out to them, organizations who were helping out with journalists, and eventually he was evacuated to Pakistan, where he stayed in a guest house with his 2 children under 5, as well as his spouse. He doesn't have legal status, just like Sarah's family. He can't work, his spouse can't work. Without having access to the RSD, there's no durable solution for him, obviously. He can't be resettled to a third country or even use economic migration pathways to immigrate to countries that are accepting talent. He is talented. He also can't be sponsored to Canada without the RSD because of everything that so far Pierre-André and Alice and Anisha talked about. And with SAWS, max spaces have been maxed out with waiting lists that are years long. So even though he has a Canadian sponsor who's willing to sponsor him, he has to live in Pakistan without status with his wife in limbo. And the organization that assisted him in evacuating and is currently supporting him in Pakistan, their support is wavering. There's funding constraints. We all know on the nonprofit side how that works. And his life has only gotten harder in the last 3 months, where his brother died in Afghanistan and his father was hit by a vehicle. So this is just Kareem's story. But under the same organization, there's 150 to 200 people with similar story living in limbo with an uncertain future, even though they have sponsors in Canada who are willing and able to get them out. It's just that they cannot obtain this RSD document. That's Kareem's story. Now I'm going to talk to you about Daria's story. Daria is a woman in her 40s. She's also in Pakistan, and she lives with her son and her husband, but she also has a daughter. In Afghanistan, she was a gender equity expert within the human resources and workforce planning space. She designed and implemented equal opportunity, anti-sexual harassment, similar programs for training, and to encourage the hiring of women in the workplace. She did a job that many in Canada still do. These are issues that we still deal with on our end, is just to a greater degree on her end. After the Taliban took over, Daria didn't initially leave, but the Taliban required her to sign into her office on a monthly basis. She wasn't allowed to go back to work. When she first tried to go, they just refused her entry, and she was forced to go back home. The second time she went, once again, it's going, just a warning, she was beaten with her husband because she was not wearing appropriate clothes, but she was wearing a headscarf and a long gown. If anybody has been following the Taliban requirements so far, things have gotten worse and worse for women. Recently, they've required women to wear the burqa again and to not leave the house without a male guardian. And if they do, then their male guardian will be punished. And then furthermore to that, they have forced women on news channels to cover their faces fully. Women are being slowly erased in Afghanistan. And this is something that Afghan women are still protesting on the street, even though international support for them and aid for them has decreased. Going back to Daria, the third time she attended, she feared for her life, and they threatened her. They told her that either she has to give up the names of the rest of her colleagues, sources for the organization's funding, or more, she would be investigated for doing work that the Taliban saw as being opposite and contrary to Islamic values. They told her that they knew everything about her. At the same time, Daria's daughter, Mina, let's call her, was working in a beauty salon to help pay for her school and to support her family. Daria, one day when she was working at the salon, once again warning, the Taliban entered and beat her up, as well as to clients. The salon was trashed, the windows were broken, and the door kicked in. They posted a sign that if the owner continued, that they would burn down the salon. This is in line with pictures coming out of Afghanistan in August, which showed the Taliban painting over women's faces and erasing them from their culture. So Daria and her husband picked up their daughter and cared for her and took care of her. But all of this together, they decided that they could no longer stay in Afghanistan, and they left. Daria knew that her women's rights activism and her public engagement would eventually come to light as well. And she knew what awaited her and her daughter and her husband and son if they stayed. She fled her home after that meeting and made her way to Pakistan. But similarly, she doesn't have the RSD. She left behind her home, her belongings, and many of her documents. She wants to work, but doesn't have the legal status to work in Pakistan or provide for her family. So they're also in limbo with financial difficulties and an uncertain future. Fortunately for Daria, her daughter was interviewed with a German NGO in Pakistan that was doing pre-screening for academically inclined students, and she was accepted within a month of that interview. And she was taken to Germany as an international student. The speed at which other countries have accepted refugees from Afghanistan is very, very different from Canada's stance. Canada was one of the first few countries to come out and say that they would accept initially 20,000, and then after pressure, 40,000 refugees. But that work has been slow, very slow. To date, I believe that number is about 11,000 to 13,000. But Afghan refugees still don't have access to many programs that are accessible to other refugees. And as a result, even though other crises came after, the number of refugees accepted from other crises have been significantly higher than those from Afghanistan. Especially given Canada's commitment to Afghanistan in entering in 2001 with soldiers on the ground and all the work that we have done, I think Canada's response to the current refugee crisis has been lacking. And the fact that they have been silent about this requirement until recently, as Pierre-André pointed out, is simply unacceptable. This is not numbers. Behind every number is a person who's struggling financially, children who are not going to school, and people who are scared for their life of being deported back to Afghanistan, of certain death or torture or abduction, as Alice pointed out, but not knowing what to do. So what I asked you to do today is, I understand that many who have attended today are already people who work in this area, who know the area, and who understand the context of the situation for many refugees. But if you are not from the field, then what I ask you to do is think of yourself, your daughter, your husband, whoever, in the situation that Daria, Kareem, and Sarah are in. Think about what you would think and whether you would still continue fighting. Because to me, the most impressive part is that these parties, these people have left and have an uncertain future, but they keep fighting and keep trying to get out and keep trying to live. So I'll just leave that with you, and thank you for listening to me.
Tamana, that was so compelling. We're grateful to the people who gave you permission to share their stories, if not their names. So please pass on our gratitude to them also. Our last
Thank you.
speaker is Mellissa Fung. We are very honored to have her with us today and for her carving out some space to share with us today. Mellissa is a veteran journalist, a best-selling author and a filmmaker. Her feature documentary Captive premiered in 2021, and she has been nominated for several major awards. Mellissa has traveled the world producing original documentaries for Al Jazeera International and the CBC, amongst countless others. Mellissa covered the war in Afghanistan as a field correspondent for the CBC, leading to her best-selling book, Under the Afghan Sky, where she chronicles her experiences as a hostage as she was kidnapped while on assignment in Kabul in 2008. Since leaving the network, specifically CBC, Mellissa has focused on human rights reporting and has returned to Afghanistan again and again to continue reporting on the challenges that continue to exist there, particularly for women and children. In addition to Al Jazeera, Melissa's work has been featured in the Globe and Mail, Huffington Post, Walrus, Toronto Star, TRT, CNN, and PBS. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including Gracie Award, Commonwealth Broadcasting Association Award, New York Festival's Gold and Silver Awards. Mellissa holds a master's degree in journalism from Columbia University in New York. Today, Mellissa will be discussing her own personal experiences in Afghanistan and her experiences in attempting to assist individuals who are applying through the Refugee Sponsorship Program. Thank you, Mellissa.
Thank you to Asiya and to DLS for inviting me to be with you today. And I especially want to thank Pierre-André and Alice and Anisha for all the very important work you're doing in this regard. I'm so grateful that you're taking up this cause, because it's just, I feel like I'm among friends, and that's great, because over the last 9 months, I feel like it's been a very lonely road I've been on. I am the only panelist who is not a lawyer, which much to the dismay of my parents, I'm sure. But over the last 10 years or so, and especially since last August, I've become way too familiar with our refugee system and how it doesn't work. Even though I still, admit that I fail to understand large parts of it. Sia mentioned this in her introduction, but some of you might already know that I was taken hostage by a group of Taliban sympathizers back in 2008 when I was on assignment in Kabul. After my release, the perpetrators started targeting the local journalist who was with me when I was kidnapped, Shakur Feroz, who was the CBC's sort of resident fixer local journalist in Afghanistan. So my colleagues, at the time I was with CBC, and I decided we needed to get him and his family to Canada. But how? And this, keep in mind, this was back in 2008, 2009. We managed to get him to India, where he waited for a UNHCR referral to Canada. And we thought, because of my unique situation and his role in it, that it would be easy. Well, it wasn't. He waited and waited, and we waited and waited. It was almost 5 years before he finally was able to be referred to Canada. And even then, it was a completely frustrating process, because once he got to Canada, he still needed to have status here, before he could find work, before his kids could go to school. So it was a really long and frustrating process, not to even mention all those wasted years where his kids couldn't go to school in India, or he couldn't work. So we had to support the family that entire time. And so every Christmas we would pass the hat to raise the money, and supporting a family of, they were 4 when they got to India, they became 5 in India for 4 years was not easy, but thankfully, the group of us found very generous friends who were able to help us do that. I'm happy to say that today he's in Toronto, and he's working as an editor at the CBC, and his kids are doing really well in school. They're completely adjusted and adapted. And in fact, when I call him now and his wife answers, she speaks perfect English, and she didn't really even speak a word of it when she first came to Canada. So he's a good news story. Once we got him settled, another translator came forward and said he was also being targeted by my kidnappers. And his name was Shakir Ghani, and he was the interpreter who spoke to my kidnappers and the negotiators that we had brought in. And so he said he was being targeted, and we started that process again, thinking that we had just been through it with Shakur. We got Shakir to India. He had a lot more difficulty adapting because of not being able to work, kids not being able to go to school, and another 4 years went by. And a lot happened to him, which I won't go into, in India, which led him to abandon the process. So after all that time supporting him, he abandoned the process and went back to Afghanistan. And I'm sorry to say, but a lot of that is happening right now. I've been trying to find some numbers, but no one really knows. I've heard there as many as 2 million Afghans in limbo in Pakistan right now, waiting to hear from Canada and other countries. And until recently, I also had a group among them. I'm going to try to share my screen now, but I'm technically not very good at this, so bear with me. So that is Akila and Manaz. Akila is the woman on the left. She was the principal of the all-girls school in the Dashti Barchi district of Kabul, the Hazara area of Kabul. The school was the target of a vicious attack a year ago, killing 80 of her female students. And I had met Akila 4 or 5 years ago when I'd gone to do a story at her school about why girls still weren't going to school, the barriers that still existed years later for girls going to school. And she showed me why. And the school, girls were going to school outside, outdoors, on the ground, under tarps, under umbrellas, and there were no bathrooms. And so she worked really hard to improve conditions for her female students at the school. And by doing so, she started to get a lot of threats, people who did not really want girls to go to school even then. And so we went back last July, and she showed me the new buildings that she had managed to procure for her female students. This was after the attack, unfortunately, but it was clear that she had, worked very hard to improve access to education for girls, and therefore became a target. 2 weeks after we interviewed her, the Taliban took over. And so she called me and she said, the story is, we were putting our story together at that point. And she said, now they're coming after me. So she moved out of her house and stayed in a relative's house, so she couldn't be found. And I, did everything I could to try to get her out of the country. I'll just break here now and just tell you who Manaz is. Manaz Aliyar was her top student a few years ago when we first went to the school. She's a law student, was a law student at Kabul University. And we'd also interviewed her about, sort of how her life had changed. And at that time, they knew the Taliban was sort of on its march. They all thought they would have some time. But it just happened more quickly than they would have imagined. So she also called and said, I need to leave because I'm now scared that I've been on Al Jazeera talking about the evils of the Taliban. And so I put her on the same list as I did Akila, trying to get them out of the country. And I still find it crazy that this work fell onto people like me. I'm just a journalist. How do you get people out of Afghanistan when the Taliban are in power? So I started to got in touch with so many people, put them on manifests to get on airplanes. And finally in late November, it was 4 months after I started, we got them across the border to Pakistan. And that's where they are. And they have been there for 6 months now, waiting for word and from IRCC, and unable to register with UNHCR, even register with UNHCR in Pakistan because of the backlog. They were referred to Sharp, who is UNHCR's partner in Pakistan, and they are booking appointments into September. So it's been really frustrating for them. And they're obviously scared because their Pakistan visas have expired. And so they really want at least to have some UNHCR stamp or, to say that we are registered. So in case they get stopped by Pakistan authorities, they can say, our visas are expired, but look, UNHCR knows we're here. And that's, where, I want to talk about next, because there's lots of stories that are coming out right now about what's happening in Pakistan and Afghans being left vulnerable to criminals and scams. Somebody reached out to me as a journalist and said, do you know that, Sharp or people who say they work for Sharp are selling UNHCR documents. So they'll put your picture on a UNHCR letter saying that you're legally allowed to be in Pakistan, but only if you give us $300-400 US. And for some Afghans, that's all the money they have. And they have fallen sort of victim to these scams. And so I think, I'm not, Pierre-André, Alice, Anisha, you have all laid it out legally in terms of, how restrictive this is. And Tamana talked about this a little bit as well, but for those Afghans who are sitting in Islamabad right now, whose visas might be expired, who may be afraid to go out, who can't work, can't go to school, we're sort of victimizing them in another way by making them go through this process and register, because there's no shortage of people in Pakistan who are willing to kind of exploit them and exploit their situation. And that's why I really I feel grateful for the work that you are all doing, because to draw attention to this, because often I felt like I'm screaming into a void, and all at the same time trying to reassure Akila and Manaz and other, especially women, Afghan women who are still waiting, that help is coming, and that is becoming very hard to do. So with that, I think I will just leave it there and let the discussion happen, because I know that there's probably a lot of questions.
Thanks, Mellissa. Thank you for sharing those stories with us, and certainly for your dedication to try to get these families out. Such a hard thing. So we have some time for question and answers. There are some questions already in the Q&A and in the chat. So I'll go through those and perhaps ask one of the panelists to answer and provide their perspective. So the first question, which perhaps I'll ask Pierre-André to answer, is that we've been told that working with an SAH is faster than a group of 5. If the UNHCR requirement is waived, do you think that G5 applications could be as expedient? Not that anything is expedient.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know for a fact that SAW applications are processed faster than group of 5 or community sponsorships, in fact. And in any case, if the requirement is waived, it is not going to move any faster.
Thank you. Tamana, I'm not sure if you want to take this next one. It's, can the UNHCR status requirement be waived for LGBTQ plus refugees in G5s, because it's very dangerous for that population to come out of certain countries?
So, I mean, if it was up to me, it would be waived for everybody. This is a policy decision made by the government. I think there is a good argument to be made to waive it for the LGBTQ plus community, given that a lot of the other countries to which people go to, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, obviously they were also persecuted there. I think this is just, once again, a policy change that we need to advocate for. And at the end of the presentation, I will kind of go through how you can help in this situation. And then it might be worth an email to an MP, or it might be worth just spreading the news itself, because the more noise that we make, and like Mellissa mentioned, sometimes it feels like we're just screaming into an echo chamber where we're all saying the same thing, but it's just us. The more we get this out to the general community and public, the higher the chance that the government will actually do it. And like Debbie said in the chat, they should get in touch with Rainbow Railroad. They have been providing support to the LGBTQ plus community in Afghanistan and are doing really, really good work there.
Thanks, Tamana. And just to add on to that, so also, I'm sure it's been said, and I'm sure the individual who asked the question is probably aware, but these individuals, for instance, from sexual minority communities can be sponsored through sponsorship agreement holders and then don't need a UNHCR status document. So that is one way, although, as was previously discussed by the panelists, the waiting list for SAWs is tremendous. And so these people live in very precarious situations for a long time and may or may not be selected. There's another question. I'm happy to just put it out to the panelists, and if someone wants to volunteer. Any ideas as to when we can expect to hear from IRCC regarding removing the requirement for the RST? I mean, yeah, we wish, right? Anybody have an informed guess?
I don't know, Pierre-André. Maybe also go ahead, Pierre-André.
Oh, well, I was just going to say I think it could be in sort of the next 2 to 4 weeks, but we don't know really. We don't know if something will be announced or if something will move. I just want to add a bit of clarification, because I think someone wrote in the chat that the requirement for the RSD, refugee status determination, only applies to groups of 5 and community sponsored groups, not SAWs, but the SAWs have caps. And the second thing is the RSD can be a refugee status determination from the UNHCR or from the state where the refugees are located in, but that has, there's also a lot of differences between states. Some states aren't signatory to the conventions or don't conduct refugee status determinations, or do it fast anyway. I just wanted to look at that.
Just a caveat on that announcement. I've been hearing that there's an announcement coming on group of 5s and the RSD since October. And so because I, was during the chaos of August, and it's a blur to me now. Tamana, you must have been through the same thing, because you just not sleeping, the phone is going off all the time. I was put through, just blindly calling people, to somebody in the PMO who said that because my women don't have a standing relationship to Canada, in terms of, working with the military or the government, that they would need sponsors, that sponsor group of 5 sponsorship was going to be the only path for them at that time. And so I do have sponsors for them. But Tamana mentioned this, unless you have a sponsorship agreement holder, or that they already have RSD determination, it's no good to have sponsors, because it doesn't, unless they waive the determination, you can have the best sponsors in the world with all the money in the world, but there's no way that group is coming. So I was finally lucky enough to get to be connected to Afghan Women's Organization. And they had all of, I want to say 10 spots for Afghans, which was frustrating to them too. So they were able to give me 6 of those spots for Akila and her family and Manaz. But without them, if I hadn't been connected to them, I would, they would still be in limbo, and I would still be supporting them in Islamabad. And so, that's just a caveat to say that it was back in September, October, when they said, if you get sponsors, there'll be word of waiving this determination soon. And we're now into almost June, and there hasn't been any. So I'm not hopeful at all.
Yeah, so if I may add on to that, since the crisis started, I guess it's increased since August, having been involved in the Afghan community on multiple fronts, we had meetings with people in the government, and I repeatedly brought up this RSD requirement because I knew that it was waived within the Syrian crisis, and I knew that it was going to pose as a problem for Afghan refugees, given that the countries surrounding Afghanistan, like Turkey, well, not Turkey, but a lot of Afghan refugees go to Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, we're already dealing with backlogs. We're already dealing with issues. And repeatedly, I was told that there would be an announcement coming. This was, August, September, October, and now, like Mellissa said, so far nothing. Recently in April, like Pierre-André covered in his presentation, there was a special committee meeting on this where they discussed this. But even then, the different things were said at different points by the Honorable Mr. Fraser. So it's hard to know if it's going to be within 2 to 4 weeks. I think that's very optimistic. Having dealt with this since August, until the government actually comes out and makes the change in writing, we don't really have anything to hold on to.
Thank you. There's another question, which is, if someone has an application number from the UNHCR, but not a refugee number, do you recommend that we start their community sponsorships? She's a journalist, a women's rights advocate from Afghanistan, and is living in Pakistan right now.
Happy to jump in here. You cannot submit the application if you don't have the refugee status determination. It will be rejected as soon as it's submitted. You can start completing the forms and getting things ready, but nothing can be submitted before before you have that document and you include it in the application. I would just also like to add a couple things quickly. The one thing is about the 40,000 Afghan refugee commitment. I think it's important to break that down, because of those 40,000, only 8,000 are privately sponsored refugees. And And within that 8,000, 3,000 are existing backlog cases that are being expedited. So cases that were already in the system. And only 4,000 are sort of new spots that are being made available to SAWs and groups of 5. And the other thing I wanted to add was that you know, we've been talking about the Afghan refugee crisis, but the call or the problem with the UNHCR requirement applies to all refugee populations. And the demand that the sponsorship community is making is to design the program in such a way that timelines are controlled and don't balloon like they used to be, but to do it through mechanisms that are, you know, fair and equitable and don't pose the same problems as this requirement on G5s and community sponsor groups. Okay.
Thanks.
Back to
Can
you.
someone, I think there's just from the questions that I'm seeing, I think there might be just some lingering confusion about whether or not an RSD is needed in an SAH, a SAW context. So maybe can one of the panelists just comment on that and make it really
Not
clear
needed.
through this
Not
brief
needed. Not needed if you have a SAW.
Okay, and so the RSD is needed for which categories then?
The group of 5 sponsored groups and the community sponsor groups. So, an unlimited number of applications can be received from those groups, but not for SAWs. They have the caps. So if you knock on the door of a sponsorship agreement holder, they're likely going to tell you we have a waiting list of years before we can take on your case.
Okay,
so there's a severe limit there too.
There's also,
sorry, Mellissa, go ahead.
sorry.
No.
I'm being told that unless you are already in the system with a G number, you know, those 40,000 spaces are pretty much gone because there's still family reunification. There's still SIMs, special measures, those who worked with the military, their families, those who worked with, Canadian NGOs. And a friend of mine who runs Canadian Women for Women in Afghanistan, she's still got a dozen people who have worked with her for years who still don't have G numbers, and there's no path for them. So now she's looking at getting them to other countries because they are considered to be women activists, right? So, it's that's the reality. And it's not, it's awful news because I'm turning people away all the time. Like there's a journalist who keeps messaging me, and unless you are already in the system, those 40,000 spaces are pretty much gone.
Just for the folks that are attending today who are, don't work in this field and have some sort of lingering questions about, perhaps we can explain the distinction between a G5, like what that actually means, and a community sponsor. Tamana, do you want to do that?
Yeah, sure. So a G5 is a group of 5 individuals. So that's literally can be any 5 people in Canada. You have to meet specific financial requirements. You have to have some money in the bank to prove that you can support the family. Depending on the family, there's different financial requirements. You come together and you then sponsor them. So anybody can do it as long as you can find 4 groups and the financial requirements. But the issue is that even with groups of 5, like Mellissa mentioned, the RSD is still required. So you can have the group of 5, you can have the money in the bank in a trust account, but it's not going to get anywhere as long as the RSD is not granted. For community sponsorship, so it's private sponsorships by organizations, churches, situations like that, with similar financial requirements, but it's organizations that do it. Similarly, the RSD is still required. So we can do everything up until there, but the RSD is not really within Canadian control, right? It's within foreign states and UNHCR, which is, I believe the UNHCR recently released a report where they're extremely underfunded for their, I guess, for their projects in Afghanistan. So they have their hands full. So it's something that's Canada imposed on other entities to reduce kind of our own workload. But that has really caused the backlog because our system is kind of useless until that final step is done. So yeah, I hope I answered your questions. I think I went on a tangent there.
No, that's great. Thank you. There's one more question from Kate, and maybe then we can turn it over to Tamana for a discussion about what we can do, right? Which is, I think, top of mind for a lot of the participants. So Kate's question is, are there concerns that an exemption for the status for Ukrainians and Afghans could end suddenly with little notice, as was the case with the Syrian and Iraqi exemptions? How might we advocate that if there is an exemption put in place versus an abolition of the RSD requirement, that the perimeters of that exemption are clear and transparent? Anyone want to take the first bit about the concerns? At least
I can take that. And I think it goes back to what, we kind of are all saying is this is required for the Afghan refugee crisis, but it's been required for every crisis so far, whenever there's a significant influx of refugees. And if we have waived it in the past and been successful at it, then we really need to question whether it's required. So I do think an abolition, like you mentioned, Kate, is better than an exemption. That said, I think in regards to requiring the government to tell us when they will remove it and whatnot, that's all policy work. That's something that we have to advocate for. And hopefully when they do kind of pull the rug, they'll let us know this time.
Anyone want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's likely if we do have oh my God, there's a raccoon right outside my window. If it ends up being waived temporarily, I think it will be announced on short notice, and it's likely going to be reinstated on short notice as well after a certain number of applications has been received. There was a lot of pushback. I remember back with the Syrian crisis, there was a lot of criticism about exactly how the rug was pulled under the feet of sponsors, and the UNHCR requirement was reinstated, I think, and that the government then said, okay, well, we're not going to reinstate it right now. We're going to allow for 1,000 more kind of group of 5 applications to be submitted. I mean, the government certainly heard those criticism, but it's unclear whether, if it changes, that they'll have a different approach.
Thank you. Tamana, so did you want to conclude perhaps with what to do, what we can do?
Yeah, and I just want to also highlight Naomi's point in the comment on the chat group, where she said advocacy should include increasing the 40,000, that there's no limit for the number of Ukrainians being admitted, and that we should also advocate for including Afghans as students, which is being done for the Ukrainians, and that there should be alternate pathways. I 100% agree with that. Like I talked about Sarah's sister, George Brown gave her the approval, the funding was there, everything was in place for this poor girl to come to Canada and start at George Brown, and they just didn't let her because of the requirements of the temporary visa application. I think that advocacy can be done on all fronts. I also agree that it should be to raise the 40,000. When I did my op-ed for when this crisis started, I actually called for 95,000 because, like Mellissa mentioned, I knew that at the time it was 20,000, but the 20,000 would include people who were already in the system. They would not be immediately going to people who needed help at that time. So of course, I think our advocacy should include everything. That said, there's only so many causes that each one of us can take. And for the purposes of this presentation, the UNHCR has been, I guess, the cause of choice. But when I do share my screen in regards to how you can help, you can advocate for everything. It doesn't stop us from, one cause. So I'm just gonna share my screen here. And I will give credit where it's due. This slide was actually first created by Anisha and Alice. So how can you help? First, advocate for policy change. Right now, that's really our only recourse, is to get the government to do it. They have done it in the past. They're doing it for Ukrainian refugees. There's nothing stopping them from doing it for Afghan refugees. So how can you advocate for policy change? Well, your local representative is supposed to be your voice in parliament. So contact your local representative, and it's very easy to do it. So just to kind of show you, our commons.ca/members/English, if you're English speaking, FR if you're French speaking, it will take you to this page. You simply put in your postal code, and it gives you your member of parliament. Their contact information is right there. Pull out an email and just write your concerns about this needs to be done. Your email does not need to be comprehensive and include case law or anything that we did. It's just to kind of raise awareness and make sure that your representative is aware of the situation and that there are people who are concerned about it. Another way that you can help is volunteer, donate, support organizations helping Afghan refugees. These are just 3 examples of refugee groups that I'm involved with. Afghan Women's Organization, LifeLine Afghanistan, the Refugee Sponsorship Support Program. You can donate your time, you can donate money, you can support it, you can raise awareness, follow them on social media. There's many ways to really help to amplify the voice beyond, like I said, our little echo chamber. And lastly, social media is important. I know that for the Syrian crisis, where the RSD requirement was waived, we were previously talking about this, and it really, a specific event had to happen in order for the government to act, and it was really, really big on social media. So we can't really downplay the importance of the social media platform. That said, I do understand that this is a very, I guess, technical argument that we are making, but it doesn't take much to say that the RSD requirement should be waived and tag the Honorable Mr. Fraser. So, the more voices we have, the better it is. So those are Alice and Anisha's points and my thoughts on how you can help going forward.
Fantastic. Do any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to add about advocacy efforts?
I would just add that we also need to kind of keep pushing the government to keep the intake or the processing, the targets at high levels, or even increase them. Because even if the RSD requirement is waived, but the targets are decreased and you have ballooning timelines, people just end up getting stuck in the processing queue for years and years and years and years, and that's not any better. So keeping up with high targets, increasing targets should also be part of the messaging, in my view.
I completely agree, because 40,000 is nothing. When you look at what's happening in Afghanistan right now, as Tamana said, every day things, and Alice in her presentation, things are getting worse by the day for Afghan women, LGBTQ+, and really all of them qualify as convention refugees under the definition. And so why are we limiting it to 40,000? You can argue every Afghan woman qualifies, every LGBTQ+ Afghan qualifies. So we need higher numbers, definitely.
And I just wanted to jump in and say one last thing, which is Anisha and I also created a PDF of links to various organizations, as well as a sort of a draft letter to your MP, if you would like to just copy paste, plop your name in and send off an email. And we'll be happy to distribute that after the presentation to make it as easy as possible for all of us to do our part and advocate more.
Thanks so much, Alice. So yeah, we do have the email lists of all of the registrants. So in the coming days, we will be finalizing the paper. And so we'll share that. And also, Alice, that's a great idea to share that document too. So thank you to you and Anisha for putting that together. And thank you so much to all of the participants for sharing your morning with us. We hope that you learned something and that you feel incentivized to help on this cause, although I'm sure most of you already are. And sincere thanks to all of the panelists for all of their time and dedication, not only this morning, but through the course of their careers in advocating for refugees. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.